Every week, both men and women lose their lives as a result of domestic violence.
For every 2 women that die, we never look at the other figure. 1 man also dies.
But all anyone in authority wants to talk about are the female deaths.
And 2 women, at least 2 women, die every week at the hands of their partners or their former partners.
I mean, if every week 2 white women and 1 black woman were killed due to domestic violence, what would a government minister say?
2 white women a week are killed as a result of domestic violence. This is a very serious problem for white women.
I don't think so, but they seem happy to ignore male deaths from domestic violence.
And 2 women, at least 2 women, die every week.
Women will, when they do murder, tend to use knives. Or another thing, they do get other people to do the murders. There's quite a lot of substitution there. Violent people are violent, be they men or women, and quite simply, if you look at what happens in a violent family, all the children are infected. This idea that the feminists try to put about, which only boys inherit the violence through the violent behaviour, is rubbish. Girls are equally affected.
I felt that if I wasn't there, she would take it out on them. The reason for believing that is that my wife was abused as a child. Her father left when she was 8. He was abused by his wife. He was told that the children would be safe if he went. He needed to go, otherwise he'd have a nervous breakdown. And the children would be safe, but they weren't. As soon as he'd gone, she started on them. She's incredibly like her mother, but she won't accept that there is anything about her that is like her mother because her mother abused her and because she doesn't want to see it.
Why do public service websites, such as the BBC's Hitting Home website, not bother to mention the 30 male deaths a year from domestic violence? The BBC says that 81% of domestic violence is caused by men, and that's why their site concentrates on women. That figure is not actually correct, but even if it was, is this explanation reasonable? If the BBC had a site on murder victims, would they say that most murder victims are white, so they'll ignore the deaths of black people? Would they say that most murder victims are men, and so they'd ignore the deaths of women? On their front page, they say they have information and help for anyone affected by domestic violence, but as soon as you look for this help, as if by magic, it becomes solely about women as victims and men as perpetrators.
Remember that you're not alone. There are thousands and thousands of women who have been through similar experiences to yours.
The 30 men a year who are killed by their wives or girlfriends are simply passed over by the media and by government. This strange silence makes no sense and can only be described for what it is. This is behaviour motivated by hate, just like racism. With the invented figure of 81% of victims being female, the BBC completely ignores well-established research that shows that domestic violence is most often caused and initiated by women. They further ignore the fact that the vast majority of violence against children is committed by women. The BBC goes on to justify why they ignore male victims. So what the BBC is saying is that because fewer men than women report that they're abused, because violence committed by men is so highly publicised, and violence committed by women is massively underreported, and because men killed by women account for only a quarter of all domestic violence deaths, the men are not worth talking about. As with so many issues to do with the relative suffering of men and women, the man's story is left untold. The reality is that female violence is deliberately ignored by the media, government and police, despite what their own figures tell them. The government seeks to deny the existence of female violence, and deny the existence of male victims. As our advertising so helpfully tells us, men can only be perpetrators of domestic violence. What kind of things go on with women being violent towards men? Because you simply don't hear about it. You never hear about it. Is it just the same stuff that might happen to women, or is it...
Well, according to the refuge that we use, and this was at the launch of our project last year, there were police there, social services, MPs and all that. She opened up and she said, I had no knowledge of what men were going through until they came to the refuge. She said, it's turned on its head all the notions that men and women couldn't mix together. That's the first thing. And secondly, she said, there is absolutely no difference between the men that come to the refuge and the women coming to the refuge in terms of what they've suffered and what their needs and supports are. She said they are absolutely identical. I can certainly say to you that the men phoning us up, in the physical stuff, they are punched, slapped and scratched, they're headbutted, they're kicked in the groin, they have knives stuck in them, they have ashtrays thrown at their heads, they have scalding water thrown over them, boiling fat, they are strangled. On the emotional side of things, nearly all of them are screamed and shouted at, so you imagine that with all the neighbours, and you imagine that sort of day after day, scream and shout, scream and shout, scream and shout. They get false allegations so that she'll go round and tell the neighbours that he's a violent man, so that they'll tell his friends that he's a violent man, so suddenly he goes down the pub and they'll turn away from him or they move off the table, so she'll isolate him.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
I do not hit my wife!
She'll threaten to call the police after she's assaulted him or they've had a row, and then in other cases that turn through to she does call the police. They'll make physical threats. I'll do this to you, I'll do that to you. They'll make death threats. You wait till you go to sleep, you'll have this knife in you. Like one of the chaps we've got runs a helpline in Scotland, 20 years he put up with it, and he was a teacher, and he said when it got to the end of the day, he said, I used to start to shake.
And these people don't leave because what?
Kids.
They feel tied to the other person?
Well, yeah, because he's got kids, so he said if I go, I don't see my kids. It's simple as that. I leave, she'll just tell me. I mean, a lot of these women say, don't you dare leave, you ever leave, because they know what they're doing. You ever do leave, you ain't going to ever see your kids again. So, of course, he would then go down on the statistics as a deserting father. He's deserted his family. The truth of the matter is that he's come to this agonising decision of, do I stay there for 20 years or 15 years or whatever it is, or do I say, no, I've had enough of it, I'm leaving. And if it's that bad, then sometimes they leave. But this bloke, he didn't. He stuck it for 20 years. He came down here for the training course and stayed here. And he said, you're going to have to put me in a separate room, he said, because I still wake up in the night screaming.
You know, they talk to me about how two women are killed every week in England by their partners. One man is killed, but they don't account for the 3 who commit suicide every week. I know those men, and I know why they kill themselves. And the new prospect, which is where whether the woman likes it or not, the man is taken to court by the Crown Prosecution Service and prosecuted.
Getting convictions is still not easy. Sometimes proving guilt is impossible without a statement from the victim. Until this year, the police were unable to prosecute men whose partners wouldn't give evidence against them. But now the policy's changed, and charges can be brought even when a partner refuses to cooperate.
The reason most women won't press charges against a man is because they know perfectly well the violence is consensual between the two of them. It meets needs they have of each other.
He was about 6 feet, wearing jeans.
No, he was wearing a tracksuit.
Since when's a tracksuit made of denim?
Don't tell me what I saw, Morgan. He thinks it's funny making me feel like shit.
Do you think you could pick the man you saw out of a lineup?
I could. She's useless.
He's right. I have a terrible track record picking out men.
You know, it's too bad that psycho didn't cross your path.
Oh, you mercy.
God! Okay. Arrest her!
Arrest me?
Okay, let's just calm down.
If it was me smacking her around, you'd lock me up!
Asshole.
Bitch! Take her away.
And that is a matter of therapeutic care. That's what I'm saying in this paper. It's a matter of therapeutic care, that they have to look at their needs and what it does to them and their children. Just prosecuting him when she's going to go straight back to him as soon as he comes out is a total waste, A, of understanding, and B, of the use of the law.
We're ready to go.
We worked it all out. We'd like to drop the charges.
Well, you can just express your undying affection to the judge.
You're not letting us go?
Not till the van shows up to take you downtown.
Asshole.
Bitch!
For men violently harmed by women, there are virtually no local government or charitable resources to turn to for help, whereas for women, there are welfare services funded by the state.
And that if there's a phone line there in a county or a national phone line, anybody that's experiencing domestic abuse should be able to phone that line and get help.
It doesn't actually make sense drawing a distinction. It really doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
Do it for any other crime.
It astounds me.
For this.
It's like having a dentist. You want to have a dentist for men and for women, and gays go to that dentist. You're white. Oh, you can't. That's just only for Asians. This one, so you can't go to that one. You can go to that one down there, but that's not open today. You know, that's rubbish. You're a human being, aren't you? It's a terrible waste of public money because it is not actually reaching out to all the victims that it should be reaching out to. And worse than that, it's excluding men. And if it's excluding men, it's excluding their children because their kids see it all. You know, when Dad's having the crap beaten out of him, or his wife's bottling him one, or she's giving him all the mouth and putting him down all the time, the kids are seeing all this. And in the worst cases, they're copping it as well. And I keep saying to the Home Office, and I say to Women's Aid or Women's Refuge, all right, I know you're only interested in women, but what about kids? Don't they count? You know, you might hate men, but what about their kids?
This is yet more hatred of men, but such is the commonality of such anti-male sentiment, you might not immediately see what I mean.
Of all the services available to assist domestic violence victims, only refuges are exclusively for whites.
It's strange how we don't appreciate how evil these modes of thought are, except when they're applied to other groups. Why is it only when you substitute men for any other group of individuals, blacks, Muslims, Jews, gays, the disabled, or indeed women, that words like this become a hate crime?
And the doctor there, she knew what was happening because I'd explained to her. She said quite blatantly, if you were a woman you could take your children and you could go to a refuge, but as you're a man there's nothing for you. There's often this image portrayed in the media that, you know, it's always the woman that's a victim, it's always the man that's the perpetrator, and that isn't the case. I think at the moment it needs to be recognised that men need help. I think the ideal thing is that there is equality, that if somebody is abused, whether they're a man or a woman, they know that they can go and get help. Abusers are both male and female, and there isn't a difference. Victims are both male and female, and there shouldn't have to be refuges for women and refuges for men. It should be that if you are abused, if you need the help, you can get it.
It's a social issue, but unfortunately the Home Office has made it a gender issue. And I would always argue, I don't even like getting drawn into statistics because I think it cheapens the whole thing. And I always say that if we are living in a truly equal society, then if only 1 in 1,000 victims is a man, he should be able to get the same sort of help as the 999 women. It shouldn't make any difference at all. If they are so keen that everybody, you know, gay, black, Jew, whatever it is, they've all got to be helped, they always seem to put a little line around men, and they, for some reason, are left out of it, and it's perverse.
It would seem that our society is currently engaged in drawing qualitative distinctions between the worth of a woman's life and the worth of a man's life, and men are coming in second every time. But maybe the BBC is not hating on men. Maybe I've misjudged them. So I looked into how the subject of homelessness is treated on the BBC. A little published fact of homelessness is that over 90% of homeless people are men. Homelessness is a very real and present danger for men. Many men are closer to this state than they might realise, particularly if they're involved in a relationship with a woman. If it comes to an end, the norm in the family courts is that she gets the house, which he pays for, and he gets his mate's sofa. So, with over 90% of the homeless being men, you might expect the BBC to mention this fact, and perhaps make a statement of the kind,
why this site refers mainly to men as victims of homelessness.
They did this with domestic violence, they'd surely do it with homelessness. But strangely enough, this isn't the case. If you search on homelessness on the BBC, they want to tell you how domestic violence leads to the homelessness of women. But we should look at what this actually means instead of what we're led to believe. Leaving out children for simplicity, the statement 16% of the homeless population does not mean that 16% of all homeless people are women escaping domestic violence. It means that of the 10% of homeless people that are women, 16% of those are women escaping domestic violence. That means 16% of 10%, or 1.6% of all homeless people may be women victims of domestic violence. A whole 1.6%. For this tiny group, the government leaps in with £9 million. This money goes to shelters and special schemes to help women, and only women, to get off the streets. A homeless woman only needs to claim that she's been abused by a man to gain benefit. In the meanwhile, the overwhelming majority of the homeless, men, are left to languish on the streets with neither help nor interest from the government or the news media. Many of these men are made homeless by court orders for domestic violence, preventing them living in their own houses, even when it's the women who've been violent.
It doesn't matter what if he's scratched and whatever, he's taken out of the situation because it's a positive arrest policy.
The Lancashire Constabulary policy is to effect an arrest where a power of arrest exists, and it's certainly drummed into officers that is the positive intervention and positive action that is expected of them at the scene of a domestic violence incident.
She said she'd hit him around the back of the head with something nasty and blood was flowing from the back of his head. So he called the police, and when the police got there, she just screamed and shouted, "Oh, he was going to try and kill me, so I did that to him." And the copper arrested him. He said, "Well, hang on, and he's, of course, then he was done for resisting arrest."
Thanks to Harriet Harman, a man can be found not guilty in a court of law, but a judge has a right to what's called a yellow card, and he can issue that to the man, and he can't, even though he's been found not guilty, go back to his own home and his children. How can we be making laws that do that?
The BBC would rather highlight how men might be responsible for the homelessness of a tiny group of women, rather than even mention the fact that enormously high numbers of homeless people are men. In light of this fact, it's somewhat surprising to see the picture of a woman heading up the site. The BBC then say that
homelessness can affect anyone. It can hit families and single people alike, young or old, men or women.
But this is quite obviously a misleading statement. If homelessness can affect anyone, then why are over 90% of the homeless men? What is it about the way our society treats men that means that they end up on the streets and women don't? And why is it that when percentages were 81% women to 19% men, which are the BBC figures for victims of domestic violence, the BBC simply dismissed the murders and other suffering of men in domestic violence incidents as a minority not worth discussing? But when the percentages are reversed, as with homelessness, the BBC tells us that it can affect anyone, men or women, and women are not dismissed.
People lose their homes for a wide range of reasons: falling out with their family, suffering from domestic violence, or being evicted by their landlord, to name but a few.
Why does the tiny incidence of domestic violence get headline billing? That's like saying,
people die for a wide range of reasons: old age, disease, and being trampled by elephants, to name but a few.